we got to know Martyn and Daniel because they joined one of our online trainings, and hearing what they do and how they do it, I knew right away I wanted them in a webinar. So we cooked this up, mainly them, and I'm very happy to have them here. And I would like to, the two of you, maybe Daniel first and then Martyn, to unmute and introduce yourself in really quickly. Daniel.
Okay, so I'm Daniel King. I'm academic in the UK and a SALT graduate as well. So we were involved about 6 months ago, and so I've learned quite a lot of things about the art of facilitation through those things. I guess we'll more formally introduce ourselves in a moment as well.
Where did Martyn go? It's Martyn. Yeah, we just sent him a message to get more light. I think that's what you're doing. Martyn, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, sorry, I literally don't have more light in my room. This is all we could afford in England, unfortunately. So this is as light as it gets for me. So yeah, I'm Martyn. I'm a lecturer at the University of Leeds in the UK. And I suppose we're going to kick off by sort of saying, you know, sort of background where this came from to some degree. And I was funded for some research about 18 months ago by the UK government to look at democratic organisations. And I suppose this idea of democratic is quite a wide one at the moment. So I was including companies coming from sociocratic backgrounds, holocratic backgrounds, but also cooperatives and all sorts of fun organisations. And I suppose that's how I came across you guys really at SALT. I'm trying to actually immerse ourselves, me and Daniel, into actual practices rather than just looking at things from afar and trying to work out how things work theoretically. We thought, well, it'd be a good idea to really immerse ourselves in the practices themselves. So part of it comes out of that, and part of it comes out of spending some time talking to coaches who are actually going out themselves and trying to help companies become more sociocratic or become more democratic, and the problems that they're going through. So that's the sort of slight background to where we're coming from today.
Thank you. And in the spirit of providing some real life, some details actually, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to do a 5-minute presentation. I swear it's going to be 5 minutes. I'm going to rush you through Sociocracy and SOFA, just because I want people to at least know one framework. You know, we're going to have a wider focus today, but so that we know when we talk about Sociocracy, I assume not everybody here knows exactly what it is, so I'm going to give some overview. And then it's going to be Daniel and Martyn's turn, and then we're going to open it up. And we'll have to see how much of Q&A and how much discussion we'll be able to handle with a bunch of people. So then typically what we do is we close the webinar formally, everybody waves bye-bye, and then we stay on. So if you have more time and you want to discuss something in more depth, that's when you can do that. All right. Really, the first step is asking ourselves, why do we want to change something? And the experience that many people have in their organizations is that meeting together with other people can be frustrating. And often people ask themselves, like, haven't we already talked about this? Why do we have to go over this again? So there's a lot of repetition often in self-governance. It can be confusing. We're not quite clear, like, what are we exactly doing here? And it can also be just plain annoying because people don't feel heard. So just looking at that piece first, one answer that Sociocracy gives to the hearing each other piece is that we talk in rounds. So a round is super simple. Imagine you have a group of people, they all sitting in a circle in some way in a meeting room, and they just talk one by one. The benefits of that are it's a safe space to talk. It's a peaceful space to listen. So it not only supports people to be speaking, but also supports people to be listening, because when you know it's not your turn, it's easier to listen. So it leads to some real listening, and that has impact on the group. So typically if people are heard more, they actually stop repeating themselves, which means you can, although it seems to be taking longer at first to hear everybody, it's actually a more effective use of time. You have more ideas out there because people, if they feel safe, they they are willing to share more of what's going on. And everybody's voice can matter in this kind of setting. The confused aspect of things. What does sociocracy have to offer for people who often feel confused in meetings and would like more clarity? One piece I really like is that in sociocracy we have circles, so small groups, that have something they do, their aim, and an area of authority that we call domain. So they get to do there whatever they want to do to make happen what they have been asked to do. So in this way, sociocracy, that's why it's called that. It's those who associate together, the socios. So sociocracy really means governance by the socios. The benefits of having this circle system is you have full authority in circles, so it can be very fast because you ask that circle and they have authority to just make a decision. They don't have to ask their boss and their boss and their boss. We have clarity of who does what. There's a place for everything and everything in its place. And every meeting is relevant because you don't sit through meetings that are not really relevant to what you're doing. Of course, if we have siloed circles, we don't know what's happening in the rest of the organization. That's why there's linking in sociocracy. As you can see here in the visual, there are two people like where they overlap that are full members of both the circles. And that we can push further. We can have circles and subcircles and sub-subcircles. We can push that as like fractals as detailed as we want to and need to. So the benefits are everything is taken care of. We can just make a circle for something if it needs doing and connect it somewhere in the system where it makes sense. It's very transparent. Everybody can look at an organizational structure and sees what's happening and who's deciding about something. Everybody's voice can be heard. So somewhere in that system, you can be heard and you can hear each other. And then the other thing is that because of the double linking, information can flow very well through the system. So the two people that are part of the other circle, they tell that circle and so on, and that's how information can be passed on. Everywhere. Last piece, the frustrating piece. Didn't we already talk about this? Sometimes groups have a hard time making decisions or even knowing how they make decisions and when they made a decision and whether they made a decision. So there's a lot of clarity in groups that don't have a mutual understanding of what their decision-making method is. The decision-making method that sociocracy uses is called consent. And it's defined by decisions are made when nobody has an objection. There's a way objections are being defined, but I'm not going to go into that in this brief round here through things. The good thing about consent decision-making is nobody can be ignored. If you have an objection, you will be heard. It's easier to make a decision than having to please everybody and get everybody what their preference would be, because you're not going for what the preference would be for everybody. You're going for a place where everybody can say, yes, okay, good enough. I don't object. It's fine. And since consent is a defined process, we also are very clear about what we decide, how we decide. Like all of those parameters that I mentioned earlier where some groups have lack of clarity are completely clear. So quick, learning organization. So there's the other piece is that we make an effort to keep learning in our organization. For instance, we do evaluation rounds. We do a lot of information sharing in the sociocratic election format. We do role improvements, so where we talk about how people are doing in their role and their jobs in the organization. And we also do feedback about product or content quite a lot and workflow. So we make a plan, that's the framework, we carry it out and we see whether what we were planning to do is actually working. One little strategy that works really well for that is, for instance, that we put a term end on everything that we decide. And that is then a reason sort of holding each other and ourselves accountable to evaluate policy at a certain time. We have a built-in support system because this circle, if they need help, can ask the next higher circle or parent circle, whatever you want to call it, for help and support, or other people in the system. All right, I think I'm going to stop here. So that is my summary of sociocracy. How many people here, for who was sociocracy, or is sociocracy new? Can you just raise your hand real quick? Not me, but okay, there are a few people, so it was worth doing. Okay, fine. Now I can stop talking and I can hand it over.
So, yeah, so thank you very much, everybody, for coming along today and for listening to this presentation. Really what we're interested in, which is a little bit of what we said at the beginning, is both of us are academics in business schools, and we've been really interested in a couple of things. The first thing really is about democratic ways of organising, of which we see sociocracy, as Martyn said at the beginning, as one feature of that. And particularly being located in business schools, we've been interested in trying to break down some of the barriers between theory and practice, between academics and practitioners as well. And this, what we're going to be talking about really is a way of, is our experiments with attempting to work through these sort of processes. And just at the bottom there, you can see our email addresses. If you ever wanted to get in touch with us, then please do send us an email, drop us a line, and talk to us. So yeah, so one of the concepts people have of universities, and particularly I guess of business schools, is the concept of the ivory tower. And that we are sort of stuck or located in an ivory tower and separate, it seems, from practice, or as one of my colleagues said the other day, the real world, and the difficulties of those sort of issues. And within academic work, there's a lot of people who've got the concern that actually what we do, has it got any bearing on practice? Is it really very relevant? And for both myself and Martyn, we work quite a lot with sort of post-structural, postmodern theories, and some of the things people get into very much the footnotes and the minutiae of who said what about particular theories and practices. And then at the end of it, say, well, actually, how many people read it? How many people care about it? Is it at all relevant to practice? And the tradition that Martyn and I come from is something called critical management studies, which seeks to critique, to problematize, to question management and how things are managed and organized, and tries to challenge a lot of the assumptions around managerialism and the way that organizations operating particularly hierarchical forms of organizing. But there's a danger that it gets stuck in a sort of a negative critique, where it is very good at saying what's wrong with practice, what the harms are, what the consequences are, what the dangers are with those things. And then, quite rightly, quite a lot of practitioners may well say, having read that, well, so what? What would you do differently? What would your approach be to these things in a different way? And I remember very distinctly as well, when I was an undergraduate student, reading some of that material, thinking about the organisations that I was part of. My background a lot is non-profit organisations, charities, and I've managed and run a number of charities in my time. And then experiencing those whilst reading the critical perspective, and said, well, what would those theorists in the critical tradition, what would they do differently? And that's a concern that a number of academics have had in recent times. So there's this sort of concept of what they've called critical performativity, which is about how do we make academic work more relevant to practice and to practitioners, to actually change things. Because in a way, there's no point critiquing management and critiquing the way that we organise and critiquing the way that we manage organisations, and revealing some of the harmful and sometimes the destructive impacts if you can't then do anything about it. So one of the moves has been to make the critical perspective more affirmative. So that's trying to look at possibilities and look at things and not just putting apart what's wrong with them, but looking at what works in them as well, and what possibilities there might be to increase democracy, the autonomy, participation, equity, and actually transform the ways organisations are run along transformative lines. And so for us, in a way, sociocratic ways of organising actually offer some possibilities, very much in line with some of the things that Jennifer's just said in the introduction about the way you get more voice and participation, but in a genuine sort of way. And so we've been interested, and there is a move within some people in critical perspectives about how do you actually intervene into practice? How do you actually do things in a way that's different? And so Martyn and I have sort of set about trying to do that over the last sort of few months or so. One of them then is about alternative ways of organising. So if critical perspectives are quite strong at saying what is wrong with conventional hierarchical ways of organising, they also have got more recently interested in alternative, some say democratic forms of organising. So workers' cooperatives, things like sociocratic forms of organising, as different ways of showing how you can actually still get things done through organisations. But one of the problems that we've identified with that is that they have still a tendency to critique, to pull apart, to question, and most of the writing of that presents them either what we've called almost saints or sinners. So either they are so keen on showing that these alternatives are positive that they write sort of praises of them as though they're almost perfect saints, and look at this as a great example to alternatives forms of organising, or they find the hidden, the invisible forms of power, of control and things, the most famous being sort of the tyranny of structurelessness debates and various hidden forms of inequality around gender or many other things like that, all of which exist, but then they almost end up, I think you can end up reading some of that material and thinking, well, actually then why, if these things, they just recreate the same problems, then actually what's the point? And so what we've felt is that then they end up ignoring what we're looking at in this presentation, which is this idea about paradoxes. So one of the core arguments we want to make today is that actually that these alternatives aren't saints, or they aren't sinners, but they are actually, there's a lot of paradoxes, and Martyn will talk us through that next bit.
Yes, so what we've decided to do is to look at it through the lens of paradox, essentially, and this idea that organisational paradox has been written about quite a lot within the traditional literature on hierarchical organisations, but very few academics have looked at it through alternative organisation. And the more and more we were experiencing alternative organisation, the more we were actually feeling these notions of paradox. It wasn't simply a sort of a case of it being a perfectly democratic organisation or it failing completely. There were sort of very paradoxical feelings that we were feeling during our own attempts to involve ourselves in these processes. So paradox, just as a sort of quick definition here is from Lewis, is so these organisational paradox denotes contradictory yet interrelated elements that seem logical in isolation but absurd and irrational when appearing simultaneously. So just as an example of this, traditionally within the literature, people have written about people striving to innovate and create new products and processes whilst also trying to maintain stability. So we're trying to innovate, but we're also trying to have stability at the same time. These two things are paradoxical, but we don't see them as almost unnecessary. We see them both as completely necessary. We also have things like careful planning and the need for improvisational decision making. So, I mean, that's very obvious within the sociocratic form of organising, as we've found, is the need to carefully plan meetings, but also the need for people to improvise and come up with new things on the run, basically. But there seems to be a tendency within the literature to overlook these paradoxes, as I've suggested, within the alternative organisational literature. So we started to think about what paradoxes we were really experiencing as we were going through these, and what were actually already existing within the literature, within the alternative organisation literature, without people even realising. So when we looked at the literature itself, we realised that within the literature, when people were actually writing about democratic organising, they were often writing about a paradox. And the first paradox that we noticed is they were writing about people desiring to relinquish power, as in managers wanting to give away power, wanting to not manage as sort of overbearing dictators, but also at the same time feeling this yearning to maintain control. Now, in the literature, they write about this as being a failure of democratic organising. And we're not quite so sure about that, and we'll come on to that shortly. The second paradox that we noticed was this sort of desire to maintain individual freedom, so to remain individually free, whilst also yearning for this sort of collective hierarchy in order to actually organise in itself. And then the third one we noticed was this sort of a desiring for authenticity, to be seen as real and something actually real in the world, but also actually just yearning at the end of the day for whatever works. So wanting to be fully sociocratic, wanting to be fully democratic, but at the end of the day, also yearning to just get by, actually make something work. So one of the key research questions that came out of this is to actually look at what form these paradoxes actually do exist in alternative organisations. And most importantly to us, it was how do practitioners deal with these paradoxes as they experience them? And we tried to do this by looking at how we actually felt about and how we actually felt whilst experiencing these paradoxes on a day-to-day basis, which is quite new, as we said, for academic literature. Most academics, as Daniel suggested, do study these things from afar. They don't go and immerse themselves in sociocratic practice. They'll just sort of write about these paradoxes from afar. But what we did, we actually ended up joining something called the Healthy Power Alliance, which some people on this call right now might know about, which has been a really good sort of vehicle for bringing together academics, practitioners, leaders within organisations which are trying to practice sociocratically and democratically. It was seen as an alliance, essentially. It's an ongoing alliance that we became part of. We were a part of the top circle. We met regularly. Daniel has an administrative role, which keeps it going. And what we tried to do through our practice was keep a diary of our involvement, of what we were experiencing on a day-to-day basis, of the problems we were experiencing, the joys, the highs, the lows, and all that sort of thing, to understand what it's like to actually take part in a democratic organisation. And out of this came three very specific vignettes, as we call them, which are basically examples, I suppose, of scenarios which really draw out what we think are paradoxes within democratic organisation. And I'll just hand it over to Daniel now just to talk about those vignettes as a method.
Yeah, so vignettes are, as Martyn sort of said, they're short stories as a way of trying to capture quite complex sets of experiences that we've had or other people might have when they're trying to write them. And these are all what we might call autoethnographic as well. So they're drawn very heavily from our own experiences and trying to embody them, but not become just self-absorbed, or at least we try not to become too self-absorbed. So what we're trying to do from that is to draw on these experiences, but then say, well, okay, what are the wider experiences that we may have had, but actually may relate to other people as well? So one of the things that we've been doing is writing and performing these, and actually then testing them out on audiences like yourselves and other people to get a sense of whether they resonate with other people. We also step back, and we've got another person who's involved in authoring the paper that we're going to write based on these, who again will ask us questions and is challenging us about some of the interpretations that we're making as well, and pushing us a little bit further. So currently we're in the stage of developing up what we're presenting today, but also reflecting on our own experiences and on ourselves as a way of learning a bit more about ourselves, but actually really learning more about the paradoxes inherent within them. What we're going to do is we're going to now read out some of these paradoxes and then talk you through some of those things. And then we'll sort of wrap up, and we'd really like our distance turn these things more discussion than question and answer. We've anonymised some of the other people. We're obviously going to talk about ourselves right now because you know who we are, but we've anonymised some of the other people involved in these things for confidentiality's sake. So the first one, most of these are sort of conversations between Martyn and I, but because it's sometimes complicated to do these things online, we're just going to read each vignette each. So this is a Skype conversation between us on our views of working with the HPA. And really what we're trying to interested as well is about how our role, this, I guess the thing to say, the background, in terms of the HPA has been trying to connect the practitioners and the consultants and the other people to academics. And so we were the lead with that. Martyn, particularly at the beginning, and then I sort of joined up a bit later. And all of these are written more at the time when Martyn was more taking the initiative at that stage. So how did your meeting with Professor T go? Was she interested in getting involved? I ask. Well, Martyn replies, she had her sympathies with the spirit of the project, but in short, no. She said she had concerns it might damage her academic integrity. Academic integrity, I asked, slightly confused. Interesting, on what grounds? She felt that she's already part of a long-standing community of researchers who she felt similar to. They research what she researches and share similar ideas and values, but she's worried she has no idea what the members of the HPA were and what they really stood for. In any case, she hated the name, the Healthy Power Alliance, especially the healthy bit. Oh, we've heard that before. Did she give an indication why? Martyn replied, no, just like the others, it just sounded a bit off, not right. She said fair or equal might be better, more fitting. Any chance that the operational leader of HPA might consider a name change? I asked. Well, I did ask. I felt incredibly uncomfortable in doing so, Martyn replies. These practitioners have been working on this project for 9 months. They have the HPA website, multiple circle meetings on a monthly and weekly basis. Proposing a name change as a relative newcomer in top circle meeting was a bit scary. Not surprised, I reply. In their shoes, I'd have been a bit taken aback. So what did they say? There was a collective laugh at first across the Google Hangouts, but to my surprise, after a reaction round, they all agreed that if academics signed up to the HPA, they'd be able to propose a name change and would discuss it and voted on it. So they're surprisingly open to it, I ask. They were. They even volunteered within the group, the scope of current members, on their views and a name change for possible future democratic ways of organising. But it did seem like anything was up for the grabs if you were part of the group. And so that one really is about whether you can give up power and try to maintain control as well. And one of the struggles we've had is we both work in, to be careful, this is recorded, but we work in quite hierarchical institutions, I guess, universities. Now, the person Martyn was speaking to was a very well-known professor, and so we're being quite used to quite hierarchical ways of organising, but then actually we experienced the idea of working in a sociocratic way quite differently, and actually that was quite challenging to some of our assumptions. And actually even changing something as fundamental as a name, particularly the healthy part of the HPA, was open for discussion and debate as well. So you've got the idea about freedom and control all happening sort of around the same time, really. And that links into our second vignette that Martyn will talk us through.
Yeah, so the second vignette is basically based around the second paradox of desiring to be free, but yearning, individually free, but also yearning for some collective hierarchy. And it's based around a sort of telephone call between me and Daniel, essentially discussing sending out a first invite about the Healthy Power Alliance to interested academics, and our struggle to actually manage to do this at all. So I'll go into it now. So I sent this blurb to John and James to get their views, and they like it, I said, but they think we shouldn't just send it out on the listserv like this, but just get a few eminent names lined up as signatures, which will carry more weight. We've been discussing the draft pitch of the invite to the Healthy Power Alliance for a week or so now, so we thought that we would send it out to a few trusted colleagues for their input prior to sending it out. We wanted to make sure that the pitch wasn't too awful, but before before it went to a wider public, thinking that they would give us a few pointers on the content of the pitch. We had not, however, bargained on what unfolded. They think, I continued, that academics get so many emails, if we just send it out without having a few big names on it, then we'll just get lost in the system before it goes anywhere. But that seems to go against the whole idea of being non-hierarchical, Daniel says. I mean, we are meant to be trying to develop new ways of working that explicitly challenge classic hierarchical forms of organising. I know, I responded. It does seem contradictory, doesn't it? I mean, it's interesting, continues Daniel, developing his line of thought. It does raise for us some interesting questions. I mean, who are we representing? Do you or we represent the academic arm of the Healthy Power Alliance? Are we writing it on behalf of the Healthy Power Alliance? Are we not trying to be figureheads? Yes, I respond in a quizzical tone. If we sign it or get some big names to sign it, then we would just be putting ourselves as leaders of a non-hierarchical democratic movement. Yet if we leave it blank, we would perhaps be leading to a suspicion and scepticism and might lose interest. We continue this debate for some time with various suggestions, like signing it as an anonymous collective, as has been done in some of the research in radical geography, or signing it as the Healthy Power Alliance, through to identifying as a list who we might consider as influential names in CMS who knew and might say yes in order to build a wider support. We continue this debate for some times and some weeks, never able to fully resolve it. So that particular vignette represents for us this real struggle that we've had between desiring for this sort of this individual freedom on the very basic line of having this organisation where everybody can contribute individually and freely, but at the same time being drawn back into this this desire for hierarchy, of actually wanting some elite names, some big names to actually sell this idea, to actually make it successful. So that's the second paradox that we were feeling. And I'll hand you over to Daniel for the third one and the final one.
And just related to that, I think there's always this tension between existing in quite hierarchical institutions like universities, at the same time trying to work in more democratic sort of ways. And that links in with our third vignette, which is around the desire for authenticity, yet yearning for whatever works as well. And this is one, again, another conversation between myself and Martyn, this time on Zoom. We discovered Zoom by that stage, where we were looking at ideas about putting together some funding bids, and Martyn was sort of proposing one within his own university. So he sent me the funding bid, and I'm now just reading it, giving me some feedback. I think you need to big yourself up a bit more in it, I state. You can show that you're central to this research, leading it, that the impact generated will be traced back to your university, which is Leeds. We're writing a funding bid for an impact accelerator grant funded by Leeds University, where Martyn's based. The grant is to accelerate work that could have an impact case study for the next ref. So this is a research exercise that's done across the UK, which meant to show the work that everybody's been doing, and particularly the relevance to practice. And so you need to stress the importance of your work in getting the funding. Look, I know that it goes against the collaborative nature of this project, but the purpose of this form, we have to make it look like you're central. We go through the form, taking out sections which show a wider variety of scholars from different institutions involved, or the benefit this funding could have to the HPA, and the wider social benefits of the project for the pre-existing knowledge that the HPA have around the ideas of democratic ways of organising, instead concentrating on how Martyn's existing publications in leading academic journals be used to inform the practices of the HPA. So it's got this whole notion about knowledge transfer. I don't like doing this, Martyn reflects. I like bigging myself up. Anyway, hello, for a project like this, I know, I respond, there's something fundamentally contradictory about all of this. So again, that's a battle between what we want to be authentic and do it in a way that we think fits within the ethos of the project, yet at the same time working within our own institutional context, then we have to sometimes do what works, which seems to go against those various ethoses. And so we've thought of all three of these as paradoxes, and Martyn will now talk us through sort of our discussion element of that.
Yeah, so I suppose the next part is, how do we respond to these paradoxes, and how did we respond to these specific paradoxes we experienced? Because I mean, we're thinking about these paradoxes, but we're not. More and more, we're thinking that they're probably more normal than you'd think. We're trying not to be as frightened by them as you would be, to actually think carefully about how do you respond to them. Looking at the literature, there tends to be three specific approaches about how to actually approach these forms of paradox, and I'll go through these one at a time. And then the first one of these is to accept the paradox. Is actually, and as Daniel could skip on a slide, is actually, learning to basically just accept the paradox as it is. So as it suggests here, as Lewis suggests, acceptance helps members avoid debates which might open Pandora's box and spark vicious cycles, and instead play through paradox by focusing on their intense tasks. So essentially, what would this mean? So in the first vignette, it would pretty much just mean accepting that there is this divide between practitioners and academics, and accepting it and delaying the sort of the continuation of this of the given scenario. And the second vignette, it would mean basically being incapable of sending the email, because you'd basically be accepting the paradox that there's this irreconcilable difference here. And just to skip to the end, that's pretty much what we ended up doing. We ended up going around in circles, stuck in this paradox of not quite knowing what to do. We ended up not sending the emails. I don't think we still sent the email now because we feel that uncomfortable about it. And in the third vignette, accepting the paradox essentially means not resubmitting the funding application, which again is pretty much what we did, because it was such a difficult situation to find ourselves in. It was much easier not to actually go ahead and do it. But I mean, this is to put a negative spin on acceptance of paradoxes. Sometimes accepting a paradox within an organisation and within a democratic organisation can be a positive thing. To actually not open Pandora's box, not actually discuss things, can sometimes, arguably, I'll leave that up to you to decide, can be a good thing, can actually help to get things done. But the second way of actually going about dealing with these paradoxes is to actually confront them. So this is actually as Ford and Ford suggest here, to confront it, perhaps by discussing the underlying logic of the contradictions, and perhaps by working through it. So I suppose in the first vignette it would actually suggest that we should have a debate about the practitioner-academic divide. We'd actually set up one of these webinars, perhaps, as we're doing now. Perhaps that's what we are doing, working through this paradox, by actually setting up a webinar and saying, what is the nature of this paradox? Why does it exist? What is the divide? What is the problem at the core of this divide between practice and theory? So that is pretty much what we're trying to do today. We're trying to enlist the help of you guys to help us understand what the issue is here, so we can work through the paradox that exists over time. The second vignette, I suppose, we could have confronted the naming issues by agreeing with the people, all the people involved, that within a 3 to 6 month period, we would have that sort of vote. We didn't really go back to the academics and say, they've agreed that, if you join, we'll do this, because we didn't think they'd be interested at all anyway. And in the third particular vignette, we thought that there might actually been a way of actually just using humour in some sort of way, of confronting it as a bit of a joke, really, of not actually taking it too seriously, this particular issue we were experiencing, this STEAM issue in particular, because we're not really that esteemed. We're just academics, for Christ's sake. It's not really that big of a deal. And perhaps to have confronted it through humour, as some literature has suggested, it would have maybe we could have just stopped taking ourselves quite so seriously and just got on with it. Maybe that was the problem at the heart of it as well. But the final one, which we're most interested in, this way of responding to paradox, is this idea of transcending paradox. And as Lewis suggests, this entails critically examining the entrenched assumptions at the very heart of the paradox itself, to almost reframe the assumptions on which the paradox is built in itself, and to reconceptualize it as something radically new. So in the first vignette, what we could have done is to actually reconceptualize this idea of relinquishing power and maintaining control within the academic practitioner separation as actually an appeal to solidarity or togetherness, to suggest, well, you know, sod these labels of academic practitioner. What we're all trying to do here together is create more democratic organisations, to create more organisations where people are treated fairly, equally, with, you know, with justice and so forth. You know, we can put these labels to one side and actually reconceptualise it as something about solidarity and togetherness. In the second vignette, in a similar manner, what we could have also done is to reconceptualise this idea of freedom and yearning for collective hierarchy, as around instead some idea about seeking diversity. So instead of thinking about who we send the email to or whatnot, it was actually just a case of, you know, we wanted to get as many people involved as possible, and we could have just thought about it in terms of seeking diversity, and that might have been a way of transcending this paradox. And then the final vignette, we could have actually reconceptualized this idea of authenticity and whatever works as actually more about a process of realizing democratic aims and actually coming up with some democratic agreement on moving this whole HPA idea forward. And essentially what we needed to do was reconceptualize the issues that we were going through. So they were the three key ways of approaching this paradoxical thing. And I think Daniel's just going to use this last slide to sort of conclude things, I think. You're muted. You're muted, Daniel.
So just really sort of rethinking and opening us up to the questions about, well, what is our role as academics? I'm not going to read, you can read the slide for yourself. But in a way, it's trying to challenge and push us beyond these sort of roles, and particularly against that sort of negative critique. And so being part of organisations like the HPA, and also our great experience as well, being involved in SALT, for us has actually had quite powerful transformative effects of experiencing those things that we are researching, being part of, and then actually living those things. So I think one of the things for us is then the negative critique you can't do when you're embodying it, when you're living it, because you are experiencing those things. At the same time, you also are aware of the some of the challenges being involved in these aspects as well. So that sort of saints and sinners, I think, by participating. And then so we're seeing paradox as a way of working through some of these challenges. But as somebody asked in the question, Martyn's already mentioned, we haven't yet sent that email. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and then we'll hand you back to Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Everybody, you might be confused. You might now be on full screen mode, and you might want to go to gallery view. If you go to the top right corner, you have the choice between gallery view and speaker view. You can go to gallery view, try it out, whatever you like best. So how we're going to go about this is, I think I would like to sort of pre-filter. We're too big of a group to do around anything like this. What I would like to do, I would like to get people's first questions out by having people write them in the chat, and then we can sort of we can synthesize them a little, maybe. Just it's a more orderly way of doing it. We will open for people to speak too, but I would like to get the first wave.
Yeah, but I mean, as well as questions, if we could.
Questions and comments?
Yeah, but also just we're really interested in what other people feel,
Yes.
whether they think these that accurately represent paradoxes they feel, and how they think these things can be overcome as well. We're interested in that largely.
So so people, I hope you are. I hope everybody is encouraged to write something in the chat. I will start. And I'm going to do what I'm going to say right away. I will just start because I'm host and I'm using my power that I have to just do that. And that is actually the strategy that I want to talk about. That's one of the strategies, right? Just being transparent about the paradox and just celebrating it as such. That is something we do quite a lot. So I don't know what this comes closest to. I wrote it down, but it sort of slipped away again from me. Just acceptance, but even more than acceptance, just loving that there is a paradox. You know, that's so that is so one pair that I am sort of working on, and it's captured in what you do, not perfectly, but I think good enough, is the paradox between equivalence and effectiveness. It sort of translates to doing whatever works. We just want to get to some result here, right? But no, hold on. We have values that we're holding here. We want it to be inclusive. We want to hear everybody. And sometimes it seems like you can either get one or the other. And it's sort of like a little, like you go sort of step by step, and you have to always decide, okay, am I just going to do the shortcut, or am I going to like do the big thing that is then going to take time? And I haven't quite worked my way through that, but I think there is really some both and in there. Maybe that's a very optimistic way of looking at it, but sort of the hope being that an inclusive process is ultimately going to be effective, but that it might not be in the small decisions. But what I can do in the small decisions is be transparent about why I decide either way. That is a very practitioner. I get that very grounded answer, and I'm aware of that. And last thing I'm going to say is that I liked a lot this, well, we're just all in this together. We want the same thing, right? You do it in your sphere, we do it in our sphere. And ultimately, everything that is being said in theory boils down to, say, a facilitator or a member of a group having to make a small decision. How do I say it? What do I say? How long do I say it for? And so on. It just boils down to so many small decisions. So that's my comment. Do you want to say something while I read the questions in the chat?
Sure.
Another using our power here. Host number 2, and then I'm going to read the others.
Everything that's coming up for me is all about the dialogue, and how do we bring the two sides, or the two parts of the paradox, or the two kinds of players together to explore. So I'm thinking of all those things that people have done about bringing to the same table the people who are the pro-choice or the pro-life people, and having a dialogue. The people who are, Republican and Democrat in the United States, etc. There was an interesting article many years ago, I think by Bernice Johnson Reagan, called, the title was something like Home and Coalition. We all need to have a home, a place where we kind of belong, and we all need to be in coalitions with people who are different from us. And so, the academics and the practitioners, need, getting in the same, what we're doing here feels like the answer in a sense, is beginning or continuing that dialogue, deepening that dialogue. Because what's central is acceptance. We need to accept, I like that word, acceptance, love what is, accept that this is a state of the art. And not see each other as enemy, but as potential allies. How do we understand? How do we give each other gifts of our experience, so that each of our work is enriched. So those are I wrote down in what did I write? Accept and engage. I didn't like the word confront, because that seemed antagonistic, perhaps. So accept and engage. Don't deny what is, accept it. And then once you've accepted it and everybody's at the same table, putting all the needs on the table, then we can kind of move forward. That's my first reaction. Check.
All right, people are firing questions right now, so I'm going to give you the first one, and you just decide who answers it. Is acceptance really avoidance? Who takes it? You know each other well enough that you will have which one.
Yeah. I mean, it pretty much is. In practice, it can be at the starting point. I think in practice, that's what it became for us. As I said, it became not sending the email. It meant not, getting on with things. It was a way of delaying, as we're all very good at doing, as we all know, putting things off because it's scary to you. You might kind of find a reason for not doing it. But I think a sort of deeper notion of accepting the paradox can actually be a as you've both just said, actually, can actually be a really liberating thing as well. So there's probably two different types of accepting of a paradox. There's accepting it and just shrugging, and then there's accepting it and feeling liberated, I suppose. And that's the two different kinds. I think an acceptance that leads you on to engaging with it can actually be a really productive one. And there's either productive acceptance then or unproductive acceptance, I suppose.
I guess as well, just building on some of that, the not sending the email, in a way, the non-decision is still a decision. So by their not sending, we've also decided not to take certain routes. But one of the things I've certainly learned through participating, actually through the SALT program, anything else, is actually the importance of feedback as part of that process as well. So whilst, say, in this situation now, you've taken certain forms of power by being host and asking a question in that way, and that works for now, but then at the end of the session you do feedback and people might say how they felt about that experience, and actually, so that feedback and that dialogue that you're both talking about is then part of, can be seen, I think, maybe part of the acceptance, because we're going to work with it for now, but then the working on the both and, as you said, through the processes as part of that feedback thing, which takes a lot of work to get to a position where you're beginning to actually question those assumptions or those values, and many other things come with that. So I think, in a way, the awareness of paradoxes, I think, is helpful in terms of it stops you thinking. I think one of the things which we didn't quite say in the presentation, but we've been thinking about, is some of the ways alternative organisations are portrayed. Almost then things seem to be perfect, and if I get it wrong, it must be me that's wrong rather than the system. And actually, when you've experienced and you go through maybe training like this or other things, you realise actually that they're not perfect systems either. So learning that there's still these inherent paradoxes relieves the guilt, which means you can actually really work on those relations and those power relations, rather than just saying, well, maybe I've just got it wrong. And I think sometimes in that saints or sinners model, we then, it means that if you're a practitioner, you're too caught up in, well, I can never achieve it, or I've personally failed if it's gone wrong. And actually, you're trying to learn to deal with social structural issues, power, inequality, gender dynamics, all these other different things like that. They exist in society as well as our little groups. So we are merely reproducing them, but we need to work on them. And the awareness of those paradoxes is the first step to unpicking those, all those things that we become embodied with, I guess, as well.
Yeah, and accepting that they're natural parts of the situation rather than, alien. They're actually normal. It's normal to experience paradoxes like this, to feel like it's not working, to feel like you're conflicted is actually normal rather than being a failure. And that's what we're really trying to drive home.
Vulnerability.
Say it again.
Strength through vulnerability.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that what goes along with it is there is no right and wrong, as you were sort of, there is just more or less effective ways, or more or less graceful ways of getting to a decision, but it isn't really right or wrong. And yeah, so that's, I guess I'm very much in the transcendence camp, because I like to just come from a place of oneness instead of compartmentalization. I want to read you another question. Of course, they move, and that makes it hard for me to track them. Has your analysis, that's how it started, it was Sheila's question that I know. Has your analysis given you ideas for how to handle your vignettes, your situations there? Have we talked about that enough, or is there anything you want to say about that? I'm not finding the question.
We tried to address that in the presentation, sort of the back end of that, really, about how we've tried to work through them. But in a way, I think part of the issue now for us is that these are experiences that we've had in the past, and actually what would be really interesting would be to see, having gone through this cycle, whether then next time we face paradoxes, whether we can work on them differently, because they only really work in and of the moment. So I think we are still learning, I guess, would be my response. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Martyn.
No, I mean that's definitely true. Yeah, we are still learning, and I think I think even something like this is a step forward in terms of trying to understand. Having one of these webinars to try and understand the academic practitioner divide in itself is a step forward and an attempt to resolve our own sort of hidden conflicts and paradoxical feelings on the matter. So maybe it has helped. Although we might just be trying to legitimize our own theory by saying that, but I don't know. Yeah.
Here's another paradox for you from the chat. What about the following paradox? On the one hand, many organizations want to empower people, and on the other hand, they belong to a multinational on-stock market, and some decisions are made top-down, are not understood, are against the interest of local business, customers, etc. So there's another one for you.
Yeah, I mean, to start with that, I think this is one of the wider structural issues about power. So you might get the classic problem that you get is you might devolve some decision making down to the team level, but then as a result of that, you're still shaped by what you've been governed to from above. So actually then one of the dangers is the iron cage of bureaucracy, that actually you control or the iron cage of teams, so actually self-managed teams, but in a large hierarchical organization, might end up self-exploiting. So these alternative ways of organizing, if they are set separate from the wider economic system, then they can only deal with things up to a certain point. And actually there's a danger that some of them, because we're becoming self-managed, you could self-manage to work harder for longer and not question the wider system. So very much recognise that as that's just the structural problems. But I guess the paradox for, say, like somebody who maybe manages or leads a team like that is, well, can I introduce democratic ways of organising, but in a largely undemocratic organisation? And I guess that's the challenge that you have.
Yeah, we've seen some companies do that. They're trying to roll out holocracy or roll out sociocracy. Less so sociocracy. But I've seen some bigger companies trying to roll out holocracy in smaller departments. So one department at a time, and it's been very interesting to see how that's happened. Where there's been some jealousy between departments in terms of this department. All of a sudden, people are given a lot more freedom and autonomy over their job roles, and it hasn't always worked. I don't think it can be a difficult thing to do. I expect it's traditionally a lot more difficult to do in a large organisation to roll out these sorts of democratic ways of working, and we've seen it with companies like Mondragon. As they've got bigger, people have started to question their democratic bases and whether they're able to continue them as they get bigger and bigger. It's very difficult to maintain. I think these things are traditionally much more easier to do on a smaller scale.
I have something here, and that is that you will not like this answer or this comment, but one given that your job is to find out and to know things. I mean, what comes inherently with a paradox is the fact that that there is no knowing, that there is no binary thing that we can make use of, and that ultimately we just have to own that we don't know. That's the vulnerability piece. Again, so that's one aspect of things. I want to hold on. There was something. Diana wrote something in the chat that I'm not sure. Maybe she wants to speak for herself. I want to just.
Hi.
There you are.
This is Diana.
Yes.
And I'll unplug the camera so that
Not with the camera. I think takes up too much bandwidth, Diana.
Yeah, do it without the camera. Now you turned it on again. I'm confused.
She turned it on, but
no, sorry. Thank you for this discussion. And I wanted to address something really specific that one of you said when you said, oh gosh, should we even send this request for well-known people to sign on to this thing first? Wouldn't that be showing power over? Wouldn't that be violating the lack of hierarchy and the equivalence. And I think that in sociocracy, that my background is I'm a sociocracy trainer too here in the US. And in my experience, when a person shows initiative and leadership, that's all to the good. And they can't possibly push people around and have power over them because the other people are there and they all have a voice. So people speaking up and saying, hey, let's try this, or doing something prior to there even being a group seems to me just fine. And secondly, when there's no organization yet and you need to get something started, everyone in the potential organization, which isn't there yet, has not agreed to all the principles and practices of sociocracy. So you're not violating anything that anyone has agreed to. I once talked to John Buck about how does a company start using sociocracy in its business. Do they have to ask every employee to give consent to it? And he says, no, the company's board of directors or CEO or director decides this and gets everybody training. And then within their circles, about the aims of their circle, they have total equivalence about what they're going to do. But the company had to get the ball rolling, so they do it in the first place. I'm not sure if that addresses what you were speaking of, but I would have hoped that you would have sent it out anyway, because to my mind, it doesn't violate anything in the principles of sociocracy. Thanks for listening.
You have a reaction? Yeah, good.
Yeah, thank you, Lana. Yeah, I mean, it was less to do with violating principles of sociocracy and just violating our gut feeling on it. Because I suppose the people we were talking about adding to this email were eminent professors. They were big names that were kind of, they were Professor X or Y from, big universities who, if other people read it, they might think, oh, wow, this is a good idea. And people tend to do that to sort of, it's a way of having power over people, essentially, and you're using people's elite status to get other people to buy into something. That's not something that really sat well with us when the aim of our project was to be much more sort of democratic and grassroots, bottom up. We didn't want to be this sort of top-down approach to getting people to do things. It might have been more effective to do that, which is what was tearing us in the other direction. I'm not sure what Daniel thinks about that. Do you agree, Dan?
I mean, I think your comment's really helpful and it's very interesting. And I think, to my mind, is this inherent maybe a poorer or contradiction at the beginning of the democratic process to go, well, we're going to do this. We're going to build this democratic organisation. Will you come and join us? And effectively, that is always power. And I think we were almost trying to escape power, but actually, you can't escape power, which it seems to me is what your question alludes to, and it's probably around our own insecurities and doubts as much as the wider questions around democracy and sociocratic ways of organising as well. We were trying to, in some ways, maybe we were trying to avoid taking responsibility, which actually, from what you've just said and what you just said, John Buck said as well, seems to be actually probably problematic, and maybe. Given the opportunity again, I'm not sure we'd quite made the same decisions. But it's always the difficulty in that moment.
Mm. Yeah, well, especially as most of those guys on the list were all men, white, middle-class men, we noticed, weren't they? About, 10 to 15 of those names, all white, middle-class men who were professors. And it wasn't representative of the kind of inclusiveness of the approach we were trying to take. And it just felt wrong, didn't it, at the time? There was a sort of gut instinct that it felt wrong. So I don't know.
Yeah, so I guess that's the other part then, is about how these processes reflect the wider social cultural values as well.
Jerry.
I was just going to add another kind of perspective for me. Whenever I don't have an answer to a question, then I wonder, if I'm asking the right question. So if the question is, should I or should I not send this email to these people, and I'm not getting an answer to it, I'm having resistance. It's like, oh, what might be a different question? So maybe it's not, will you join us? But it's, hey, we're talking about this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So it becomes more equivalent of, I'm curious about you, not just will you join us.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. It's exactly what we did. That's exactly what we did. We did email those elite people, and we said exactly what you just said there. What do you think about what we're doing here? We did exactly what you just said there, which is really funny.
So what did people think?
Well, they were like, well, it sounds like a good idea in principle, but they wanted a lot more details. They wanted things. They were like, so what does this? So they wanted the whole thing mapped out for them, as academics often do. They want you to have written the book about it first, and before they sign up to it, because again, it goes back to what that other professor was saying about, am I going to put my neck on the line for this? And it turns out to be an absolute disaster. Because academics tend to be less risky. They tend to not take risks with things like that, because it is quite scary for them, as it has been for us, to go out and do stuff rather than just write about it theoretically, which is easy because it's not scary to sit in my house and write about theory of democracy, theory of power. But the worst that can happen is I can be desk rejected from a journal, and another academic can tell me I'm crap. If I go out and actually do it in practice, it can be quite embarrassing. So it's a much scarier thing to do, I think, which is what stops us.
I guess the other thing as well, Jennifer, you talk about not knowing and the issues around that, and it seems to me that's sometimes knowledge and learning and books and all of that is a sort of a way of protecting us from the world, and actually sometimes going in and not knowing what we're doing, which actually we spend a lot of our lives doing, really, isn't it? We don't really know what we're doing often, at least I don't. But that maybe actually it's about making ourselves more vulnerable and more open to learning those possibilities, rather than having in advance knowledge that is there as a protection. I must know all about this before I participate. And actually, what I really enjoyed with SALT, I remember the very first session going, I'm here to learn about and through the experience of learning. And actually, that was a really enriching experience, rather than being on the other side, normally teaching something, to actually just come in and go, right, I want to learn about this process just by doing. So that's very good. That was very helpful for me and healthy, actually.
Well, Sheila wrote it in the chat, and it's sort of the obvious answer is well, running small experiments like you guys did, right? That's what gives us new data. You made sure you had some new data, and then a side discussion that I had here with John is the being transparent about being in a paradox and having to make a choice. Just that for me, that's the liberating piece of like, oh, I can just say, I have no clue. I'm going to try this, and I'm going to try it for the following reasons. I know that is not a viable approach. That doesn't scale to the paradox that you're living in. But that's on an organizational level that works. Did you have anything? Otherwise, I would call around.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that. So what Martyn and Daniel did then got those academics to ask you questions. We want to know more. Terrific. Instead of you trying to push information at them, they were wanting to find more information from you. Success. I call that success, that you're in the dialogue there and they're interested. So.
I would like to hear from the people who haven't spoken. And I will do so by doing a round. If you want to pass, that's totally fine. But often people then do say something, and they wouldn't have spoken up if they hadn't been asked. So having been asked and passing is different from not having been asked. So